I would like to welcome you back to our keynote presentation today. And for those of you who are just joining us for this evening, I want to make sure that you know that I'm Nora Salas. I'm the director of the Cucci office and an associate professor in the history department. And the Cucci office itself was created through the generous support of Dr. Paul Cucci, a Grand Rapids resident and retired anthropology professor. Although Buzz, as he was known to his friends, unfortunately passed away in 2017, his vision of an office at GVSU dedicated to the collection, preservation, and dissemination of the diverse histories of underrepresented groups lives on through our activities. And we would really like to thank everybody who donated to support this event and all of our volunteers as well. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our speaker for this evening, Professor Jennifer Bonnell. After her address, we're going to have a question and answer period. At that time, please use a microphone to ask your question. And those of you who've been here all day will have heard me make this announcement, but I'll make it again for our new guests. It's really important for you to use the mic so that everybody can hear you. There is a little bit of accessibility, and we don't know everybody's hearing here in the room. And also, we are video recording the session so that others can see it later. And if you don't speak into the mic, then the audio is not super clear when you're asking your questions. So that would be great. And I will come around during the Q&A period. Yes. Tonight, though, I'm delighted for our main event with Professor Bonnell, who joins us all the way from York University in Toronto, Canada. Dr. Bonnell is a historian of public memory and environmental change in the 19th and 20th centuries in both Canada and the United States. She has written 2 books, one, A History of Wildlife and People in British Columbia, and another on Toronto's Don River Valley. Currently, she is completing a work on honeybees, environmental change, and beekeeper advocacy in the Great Lakes region, which will be published soon. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Bonnell here to GVSU.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the Cucci office, Director Nora Salas for inviting me, to Mary Williford of the Cucci office for all her assistance in getting me here, and to Rania Swayamprakash and her colleagues from Grand Valley State's Environmental and Sustainability Studies program for the warm hospitality over the last couple of days. So I also wanted to say Anthony Meyer's here in the office, and he's brought, some rather fitting props to help decorate the stage. And I think he'd be willing to chat about what these are and to if you wanted to come up after the talk and chat with him about the beekeeping swag here on the stage. So I'd like to begin by talking about how I came to this project. As Nora mentioned, I'm an environmental historian of 19th and 20th century Canada and the Great Lakes region. My work explores people's changing relationships with environment over time. My first book, which came out in 2014, looked at the environmental history of Toronto's iconic Don River Valley. And for those of you who haven't been to Toronto, it's a city it's a city of ravines cut out by glacial meltwaters thousands of years ago. And the Don River Valley skirts the eastern edge of the downtown core. This book explores the ways this ravine space at the edge of the 19th century city was used and understood by different groups of people as a dumping ground, a refuge for the homeless, a blank canvas for industrial plans, and a vital urban green space in the heart of the city. But over the course of my research, I continued to come across references to beekeepers, from early 19th century honey hunters who scoured the valley for bee trees, to successful commercial operators who sowed the valley with honey plants like sweet white clover, to squatters like J. Rice Murphy, or Murph as he was known, who kept 50 colonies of bees along the rail right-of-way north of the of one of the main bridges in the city in the 1930s and 40s. And also to valley cottagers. So there was a group of cottagers in the city, Charles Sorial is one of them, who would pick up his family when spring came around and move them just a kilometer from their home on the city grid into the valley and to summer cottages in the valley. And people like Sorial feature in my book on the valley, but he was a beekeeper. And he kept a large apiary at his summer cottage in the 1940s and 50s, and he wrote about his experiences. So I was intrigued by the historical and ongoing significance of the valley for urban beekeepers and the relationship between changing environments and the people and insects who depend upon them. Valley beekeepers then became the basis for a larger research project on the history of beekeeping and environmental change in Ontario and eventually neighboring Great Lakes states from about 1880 to 1940 is the framing of the project. It really began, as I've said, as a sort of side interest of this other book in Toronto, expanded to Southern Ontario. And really, when I dug into the archival records, I recognized the amount of transnational communication across the region, not only between scientists, but also between beekeeping associations. And hence, the frame of the project grew to encompass neighboring Great Lakes states. So you'll see my reference to this kind of transnational communication as I move forward. But I wanted to start by asking the question that I think is a pertinent one right now, and that is why honeybees. As many in the room will appreciate, honeybees are an introduced species. They accompanied missionaries and later early Euro-American settlers to this area and others in the 17th and 18th century. And from an ecosystem health perspective, it's native bees and other pollinator species that perhaps deserve our attention more. It's these native species that are often outcompeted by more numerous and more efficient honeybees, certainly in agricultural landscapes. But from a historian's perspective, honeybees come with records. And, by coming to understand the challenges faced by beekeepers in a time of rapid agricultural and environmental change, I think we can extrapolate to consider similar challenges faced by all pollinator species. Thinking about honeybees through the experiences and records of their keepers is part of a larger shift in historical practice to consider the history of animals. If we, widened as historians, if we widened our analysis since the 1960s to imagine the experiences of groups of people who left few historical records, women, workers, migrants, etc., this latest turn perhaps considers the most underrepresented of historical actors of them all. How to unearth useful sources and write about the role of animals in history without resorting to what Harriet Rietvos has called clumsy ventriloquism is something I and other animal historians contemplate in our 2023 edited collection, Traces of the Animal Past, featured here. So turning back to this research project that I have been carrying with me over the past 10 years as other projects have intervened and new jobs have occurred. And anyway, it's one of those projects that I keep hauling back to the center of my desk and trying to complete. I explore the efforts of beekeepers to tackle a range of threats to their operations, from infectious disease to insecticide poisoning, I look to their ways of adapting to changing forage conditions. For example, the loss of native basswood trees with deforestation in the 1880s and 90s, and the shift away from clovers and other legumes as cover crops with changes to agriculture in the early 20th century. I also look at the ways beekeepers work to tailor urban environments to serve their interests. For example, seeding places like Toronto's Don River Valley with sweet white clover. So I'm interested in beekeepers as sort of landscape architects of sorts. And also the shift from honey production to pollination contracts and migratory beekeeping beginning in about the 1920s. Today, I will focus on one component of that research, beekeeper responses to the threat of insecticide poisoning in the late 19th century. I'll show how beekeepers became early advocates for environmental protection in response to a potent threat to their livelihoods, and identify them as an important and really largely overlooked collective voice in the history of insecticide controversies. We don't tend to hear much about beekeepers. Deeply familiar with the amenities and the threats of surrounding land uses for their honey crops, beekeepers pressed for prudent insecticide use and bee-friendly horticultural practice more than half a century before the more familiar insecticide controversies of the post-war period. As we will see, rhetoric surrounding incidents of honeybee poisoning in the 1880s and 90s exposed the interdependent but often troubled relationship between fruit growers and beekeepers. And that's certainly a big part of my story today. Part of the tension, I argue, rested in the fact that growers did not always understand the role of honeybees in fruit pollination. Advocacy work with growers in this context became as much about urging caution in spraying operations as about educating growers on the value of honeybees to their operations in the first place. So I'd like to turn to just talk about my sources briefly. So I worked with records of beekeeping associations from across the region. For example, here in Michigan, the Michigan Beekeepers Association, established in 1865, is the oldest continuously operating agricultural organization in the state and one of the oldest beekeeping clubs in the country. And certainly the same can be said of the Ontario Beekeeping Association, which established in 1881. So these were really founding agricultural organizations, and I would say they banded together early because of their sort of marginality on the edges of the agricultural production landscape, needing to band together to support often threatened interests. I worked with weekly periodicals such as the American Bee Journal out of Illinois, the monthly ones like Gleanings in Bee Culture, published by the AI Root Company in Ohio. And these were periodicals that were read on both sides of the border. And for a historian in, the 21st century, and especially over the last 5 years, there's just been an explosion in the amount of digital records that are available to us. So much of these journals are now digitized and keyword searchable, hence the ability to even, embark upon a kind of the transnational study that I'm doing here. My findings were supported, as I've suggested, by this really lively regional and transnational knowledge networks as I'm thinking about them. Among 19th century beekeepers and sort of allied entomologists who were concerned about the fate of honeybees in a changing agricultural landscape. So university and state experimental farms in Ontario, Michigan, and Ohio especially became important nodes in a network of communication between scientists and practitioners in the region. So why the Great Lakes? And I'm maybe anticipating some questions here. By the 1880s, the southern Great Lakes region constituted what can be considered the heartland of early North American commercial beekeeping. While today we associate the Great Lakes-St. Lawrence River corridor with urban development, in the 19th century, associations with the region were predominantly agricultural. extended growing seasons in lakeshore areas like this one, across the region, supported the development of specialized fruit belts, and the favorable climate, expanding transportation networks in the late 19th century, and already established agricultural landscapes provided excellent conditions for honey production and distribution. If we think today of beekeepers in the South and in the West, in places like Texas and California, Alberta and Saskatchewan, these come to dominate the industry after the 1920s. But it was those in Ontario and New York, Ohio and Illinois, Michigan and Wisconsin that kept the majority of honeybees and produced the bulk of US and Canadian honey until that time. Beekeepers began publicizing reports of honeybee die-offs as a result of insecticide poisoning in about the late 1880s. Illinois beekeeper John Smith reported one of the earliest incidents in a May 1889 issue of the American Bee Journal. The apple bloom that year, he informed his readers, had proved a death warrant to millions of bees in his immediate neighborhood, when the owner of a neighboring orchard sprayed his trees with a solution of Paris green, copper acetoarsenate, when the trees were in full bloom. Smith conducted a tour of neighboring apiaries and found that all the bees within a 3-mile radius of the orchard had been affected. He lost 60 of his own honeybee colonies and estimated that at least a dozen of his fellow beekeepers were, quote, totally ruined as far as getting a spring crop of honey. Incidents of honeybee poisoning began to accumulate across the region in 1891 and 1892. And these losses proved especially pronounced in Michigan and Illinois, where spraying was most widespread. And this is an image of from the Pennsylvania Historical Society, I believe. And I want you to note this is a horse-drawn, horse-powered spray pump. This is technology that will change towards the end of my talk. And I'd also like to point out really the racialization of risk that this photo demonstrates for us in terms of spraying lead arsenate. Not only for the horses in the picture, but for the racialized workers in the picture. Other jurisdictions, however, were not immune. In 1891, several members of the Ontario Beekeeping Association reported incidents of losses, especially among apiarists adjacent to commercial orchards. The compound used most frequently in Canada and in the US at this time was Paris green, a highly toxic arsenical compound widely used to color paint. Growers used the poison to reduce damage caused to fruit by insects such as codling moths and caterpillars. By 1889, when the American Bee Journal first recorded the problem of insecticide poisoning, North American orchardists had been experimenting with arsenical poisonings for about 20 years. Insecticide use, however, was not yet widespread, as I've suggested, especially among Ontario growers. The steady increase of insecticide use by orchardists really fits a broader pattern of agricultural modernization in North America in the late 19th century. We've got this ever-expanding transportation system, coupled with the expansion and the intensification of really a lot of agricultural holdings, but orchards in particular. And it creates, of course, highly favorable conditions for insect outbreaks. Historian James Wharton described this growing frequency and severity of damage from insect pests as the, quote, insect emergency of the 1870s and 80s. And by the early 1900s, insecticides had become an essential component of industrializing agriculture. For growers, the positive effects of spraying upon their crop yields were indisputable. Prior to the spraying, one Trenton, Ontario farmer commented in 1891, quote, "We could scarcely keep a perfect specimen of an apple. With use of Paris green, we would not find in 50 barrels of apples 1 barrel of bad ones." Fruit growers were not the only advocates of insecticide spraying. Influential scientists, too, advocated unbridled spraying in the early years of the debate, downplaying the threat to honeybees. As honeybee losses to poison sprays increased in the early 1890s, however, beekeepers and scientists alike grew increasingly alarmed. And among those was the influential entomologist Albert J. Cook of the Michigan Agricultural College, now Michigan State University. Credited with really developing the spraying system for fruit trees and considered the highest authority on spraying in the country, Cook may well have felt some personal culpability for beekeeper losses. An economic entomologist and an authority on beekeeping, he understood the valuable role of honeybees in agricultural production. His concern for the vulnerability of honeybees and their keepers led him to pen the first of a series of influential essays in 1892. And in it, he stressed the unlikelihood of otherwise strong colonies of honeybees dying in large numbers at the time of the spring bloom, noting that, quote, every well-informed, experienced beekeeper knows that such mortality at such time was previously unknown. In every case, he continued, large orchards in the immediate vicinity had been sprayed with the arsenates while the trees were in bloom. So Cook goes on to conduct the first of a series of toxicity studies. And it's important to note that these toxicity studies were among the first toxicity studies of any kind in this period. So thinking about toxicity on honeybees, we're very early on in toxicological work, which, by 1894, he had shown, not surprisingly, that Paris green was highly toxic to honeybees. For Cook, the remedy did not lie with reducing insecticide use or exploring alternatives. Instead, he argued, the problem could be remedied through attention to the timing of the spray. Honeybees visited fruit tree orchards to forage for nectar and pollen only when the trees were in bloom. Their exposure to risk was limited to a brief, typically 2-week window when the blossoms still clung to the branches before the fruit began to form. So Cook proposed a simple and practical solution: stop spraying during the bloom. And, armed with this kind of conclusive evidence of honeybee sensitivity to arsenates and a compelling message about the timing of insecticide applications, Great Lakes beekeepers set out to educate their neighbors. It's important to point out here they're very careful to avoid a kind of anti-spray stance. Many of them are farmers and growers themselves, these beekeepers. Relationships with neighbors are, of course, important. And, that there just doesn't seem to be any room for that. Instead, beekeepers advocated, as Cook had suggested, for judicious, time-sensitive spraying. Agricultural extension offices and apiculture suppliers produced bulletins and pamphlets to educate growers on the issue, including Cornell University's free and widely used spray calendar, variations of which were used on both sides of the border. But here's where beekeepers in Ontario adopted a really different approach, electing to pursue legislative remedies to protect their interests, good Canadians as they were. So a delegation from the Ontario Beekeeping Association to the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture leveraged the passage of an act for the further protection of bees as early as 1892, and this was the first of its kind in North America. The act stipulated that fruit trees could be sprayed only after the bloom had fallen, thereby protecting bees from harm. And this was not so revolutionary. It was generally accepted by Ontario growers who noted that they only ever sprayed before and after the bloom, mid-bloom spraying being less effective in targeting insect pests and potentially damaging for fragile blossoms. So the objections were limited to just a small minority. The Ontario legislation prompted several American states to pass spraying legislation in the late 1890s, including Michigan and New York State. Of course, exceedingly difficult to enforce. Counter-lobbying by fruit-growing interests, however, saw spraying bills rejected in other states, including both Ohio and Illinois. And this points to, as I was telling Anthony at the dinner table, following this thread, pulling this thread, revealed, in terms of following the sources, revealed some unexpected stories, and I'll talk about a few of those now. So especially in the US, at least in my research, misconceptions about the process of pollination and the intersecting interests of beekeepers and fruit growers proved pervasive, limiting the effectiveness of their appeals. And I should say, I did see evidence of this in Ontario as well. It's certainly the minority position, these misconceptions. A lot of growers knew perfectly well that honeybees were good for their crops. As historian James Wharton has shown, prior to the late 19th century, bees were more often viewed as an enemy than an aid to agriculture. And it's really a minority of growers in the period I'm looking at who hold to these older assumptions. Grower animosity toward neighboring beekeepers became especially pointed in cases of injury to ripening fruit. Theodore Woodruff, a fruit grower from Niagara Falls, Ontario, testified at a provincial hearing for spraying legislation that the bees, quote, rob my orchard every year. I know it by experience. They sting the fruit and eat them. I have known them to eat a peach nearly up. Woodruff's complaints were, like many borne by beekeepers, a case of mistaken identity. It was the malicious wasp and not the industrious bee that was to blame for damage to ripening fruit. And I think birds get in there as well in terms of making those first, piercing the fruit in the first place. But in the US, tensions between beekeepers and fruit growers ballooned into lawsuits in a few cases. And of course, these are a historian's dream. Beekeepers were successfully charged with trespass in New York State around the turn of the 20th century. And this resulted in a requirement for beekeepers to pay pasturing fees for bees in Delaware County, New York. I have been really trying to follow this thread in terms of how long this lasted, but I do know that in the early 1900s, beekeepers were paying their neighbors to pasture their bees. Bizarre. In 1889, a case between two neighboring brothers in New York State, one brother was a fruit grower. This is a novel in the making, right? One was a fruit grower, one was a beekeeper. And this case results in a much celebrated exoneration of honeybees as agents of fruit destruction. The plaintiff alleged that his brother's bees had punctured his peaches and drained their juices, destroying the fruit and causing the branches of his trees to wither and die due to the acidity of the dripping juice. The case was debated by two of the leading lawyers of New York State. One of the expert witnesses, U.S. Department of Agriculture entomologist Frank Benton, proved especially convincing. Bees, he argued, quote, in no case are the first cause of fruit being injured, as it is not possible for a bee to puncture the skin of even so tender a thing as a ripe peach. He blamed the withering of fruit and trees instead on a bacterial disease of peach trees known as the yellows. The jury ruled in favor of the defendant, giving beekeeping interests authoritative backing to their claims that honeybees were necessary assistants rather than pests of the orchard. So it's within this kind of context of widespread uncertainty and occasional animosity towards honeybees and their keepers that beekeeping associations throughout the Great Lakes sought scientific evidence to demonstrate the value of honeybees to the orchard and their role in enhancing crops and profits for fruit growers. A series of pollination studies are conducted by some of these allied entomologists in the 1890s, and they added fuel to these efforts to convince growers. Studies showed that trees in full bud exposed to honeybee pollination produced exponentially more fruit than unexposed trees. Together with advocacy efforts by beekeeping associations and activist scientists like Cook, these studies also reduced the frequency and the severity of poisoning incidents. So ignorant or malicious activities continued, but as the exception rather than the norm. Beekeepers learned, however, that success in honeybee protections would be partial and fleeting, and this is, one of my main arguments in this talk, and I'll explain. So the lessons of the 1890s would be forgotten and relearned on multiple occasions as the 20th century unfolded. By the 1910s, beekeeper confidence in spraying precautions waned in response to the widespread adoption of lead arsenate by orchardists. Prized for its greater effectiveness and superior adhesion to foliage, lead arsenate was less likely to be washed away by spring rains, renewing beekeeper concerns about honeybee exposure to spray residue. Around the same time, the replacement of those horse and hand-powered spray pumps with gasoline-powered ones furthered the ease and the extent of insecticide use. The sort of cycle of technological change, cycle of changing compounds. Resulting increases in the prevalence and persistence of arsenical insecticides force beekeepers to renew their pleas for caution in spray applications. Again, so I hope you'll notice this cycle I'm spinning out. The advent of pollination contracts in the 1920s gave beekeepers reason to believe once again that their interests would be protected. Written agreements between growers and beekeepers that outlined the terms for renting honeybee colonies for pollination services, pollination contracts provided a formal mechanism for honeybee protection and compensation, theoretically at least, for beekeepers in the event of losses. But as orchards intensified production in the 1920s and 30s, expanding in size, specializing in fewer varieties of trees, insect pests, not surprisingly, grew more prevalent and difficult to control. Orchardists responded with larger and more frequent applications of arsenical insecticides, leading beekeepers to pull back their colonies from orchard locations and provide pollination services with greater trepidation. Meanwhile, old debates about the timing of the spray and the toxicity of arsenical insecticides to honeybees continued to resurface periodically. Beekeepers responded with weary indignation, for example, to the claims by a Stanford University entomologist in 1924 that spraying during the bloom was not harmful to bees. Shame. Blasting his claims with reference to recent and more comprehensive studies to the contrary. Fleeting faith in technological solutions, such as the use of bee repellents, sulfur, creosote, and carbolic acid, they would add these bee repellents to spray compounds, marked a return to another lesson of the 1890s. Substances like these, introduced periodically through the 1890s and early 1900s, garnered initial enthusiasm among growers and beekeepers alike, only to be rejected by beekeepers for their disappointing performance. So that reach for sort of the easy fix. Changes in the post-war period were especially disastrous for beekeepers. The release of DDT and other broad-spectrum synthetic insecticides after World War II proved even more damaging to apiaries than the arsenates they replaced. The lethal effects of these new chemicals were exacerbated by changes in spraying practice. For example, the use of airplanes to distribute insecticides created the novel problem of drift onto non-target plants. Aerial spraying also transferred the control of insecticide application from the farmer to third-party aerial spray operators. So for beekeepers, this transfer brought about a real slippage in hard-earned knowledge about honeybee protection. the results of decades of advocacy and education efforts with orchardists. While growers had generally, by this point, adopted the practice of spraying after the bloom had fallen and early in the morning when bees were less active, spraying companies tended to be a lot less discriminate. Losses suffered in this context contributed to the steady decline of beekeepers and bee colonies throughout the region after 1945. And these are Ontario figures showing beekeepers in red and colonies in green as a percentage of the total, just to give a greater sense of this decline after 1945. From my preliminary research, certainly these figures are very similar in places like New York State. I have yet to review the Michigan records, but I expect to find something somewhat similar. Maybe you'll tell me differently. Decisions to fold operations were informed by old frustrations. Beekeepers would find, as they had in the late 19th century, that they had very little recourse in cases of poisoning. The pursuit of legal remedies occasionally led to a reversal of charges when, through a strange twist in the law, beekeepers could be accused of trespass, as I've suggested, in that their livestock had been poisoned while foraging beyond the bounds of the keeper's property. And as far as this is not this kind of illegal situation didn't happen in Canada, but it happened certainly in New York State, and I'm looking to see where else. Honeybees' really fundamental freedom to forage and the problems this presented for their keepers underlay the spraying debates of the 1940s and 50s, just as it had in the 1890s. And like the 1890s, beekeepers faced the added challenge of limited evidence in efforts to press for damages. Unlike cases for fish, for wildlife, for larger livestock, and many of you maybe in the room are thinking of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, 1962, where she used all this evidence, right? Where poisoned carcasses provided both evidence for examination and convincing visual support for lobbying campaigns. Honeybee poisonings too often left dead bees scattered all over the countryside and none in the hive. Beekeepers learned from experience that without concrete evidence, excellent records, and witnesses to the damage caused to one's colonies by another's application of pesticides, they stood very little chance of success in court. It's really not until the 1950s, when grower interests were themselves compromised by spray technologies, that beekeepers again achieved some limited gains. Surprisingly, it shared concerns about the effects of herbicides and not insecticides would do more to unite beekeepers and fruit growers in efforts to urge caution in spray application than past efforts to bring about regulatory control. Incidents of crop damage caused by drifts from roadside herbicide applications awakened grower concerns beginning in the 1940s. With the commercial release of 2,4-D in 1945, which brought about serious losses to cotton, melons, tomatoes, grower concerns exploded. In response, several Canadian provinces and Western states passed legislation in the early 1950s requiring insurance, commercial licenses, and special permits for herbicide application. And we see federal legislation in both Canada and the US by the 1960s and 70s. So beekeepers looking back at this have talked about herbicides as benefiting the apiculture industry by causing all growers to be alert to the probable damage that can be done by drifting chemicals. Greater precision in pesticide application, however, was cold comfort for beekeepers in a period of rapid increases in the number of commercial insecticides available on the market and the widening range of uses, agricultural, commercial, and residential, to which they could be put. So moving towards some conclusions. Between 1880 and 1900, as I've shown, Beekeepers in the Great Lakes region established themselves as advocates for environmental protection at a time when really few others saw reason for concern. In seeking to defend their economic interests, they emerged as really the only agricultural producers in the late 19th century to form a united front urging caution in insecticide application. Beekeepers on both sides of the border worked to mitigate risks and reduce their losses. First in Ontario, then in Michigan and New York State, they drew upon the support of state and provincial agricultural colleges to advance their concerns and obtain legislative remedies. Their efforts to convince growers had associated benefits in demonstrating the value of honeybees to crop pollination at a time when this was not widely appreciated. And by the turn of the century, these efforts had really borne some limited success in reducing incidents of honeybee poisoning. Over the longer term, however, as I've shown, efforts to protect honeybees from harm brought greater frustration than success. More often than not, mid-20th century apiarists found themselves in the same position as their 19th century predecessors. Existing legislation regulating the timing of the spray was not only difficult to enforce, but increasingly irrelevant in the context of pesticide drift, so this aerial application. The heavy burden of evidence required by the courts continued to stymie beekeeper claims for redress. Much of the education and advocacy work that beekeepers undertook was also kind of frustratingly fruitless. Don't mind the pun. So the view that American Bee Journal editors held in the mid-1940s that the public had only recently become awake to the importance of bees and pollination, this is the 1940s, mirrored statements that beekeepers had made 50 years earlier when they'd just been like, okay, finally, our education campaigns have borne some success. Well, they say the same thing 50 years later. In both periods, beekeepers found these grounds for encouragement in evidence of growing awareness and used it to advocate for reasoned discussion rather than agitation. So this is really, you see it throughout the beekeeping records. Let's not get, these growers are our neighbors, we're growers ourselves. Let's just aim for reasoned discussion. As California honeybee scientist John Eckert wrote in 1952, the value of honeybees to agriculture is being realized, and the apiculture industry can profit more by demonstrating this fact than by militating against the use of pesticides. But just as in the 1890s, reasoned discussion would be disappointingly inadequate. Assurances from orchardists would prove difficult to rely upon in the context of new technologies and new practices, and in the absence of a broader recognition of the ecological consequences of insecticides. And the bees, as ever, would prove difficult to contain. So I'll close with just some brief reflections. Why, I wondered, did beekeepers find themselves teaching and learning the same lessons? I think in large part, the answer lies in something I haven't yet discussed, which is the question of power. The really differential economic and political power among producer groups that's at work here. Orchardists and agriculturalists held larger commercial interests and greater political capital than commercial beekeepers in most situations. Earlier directives to refrain from spraying while the trees were in bloom had really largely aligned with orchardist interests. Mid-bloom spraying was, most of them said, at best ineffective in controlling fruit tree pests. But as we see these spray volumes, persistence, and toxicity increase, implementing honeybee protections became more costly and more inconvenient. Growers' more powerful interests left beekeepers and their bees to shoulder the risks of an increasingly toxic countryside or to fold their operations, as many chose to do after 1945. I think another thing at work here is that faith in new compounds and new technologies and a kind of preference for the complex over the simple solution, developing bee repellents, for example, rather than curbing spray use, also contributed to the slow and cyclical nature of pollinator protection strategies. Finally, a kind of forgetfulness has contributed to repeated cycles of honeybee losses and corresponding beekeeper advocacy. In the 1900s, as in the 1920s, beekeepers felt they had solved the problem of grower misconceptions and carelessness in insecticide applications. But in each case, the advent of new, more efficient compounds and more effective spray technologies meant they had to advocate for protections all over again. We continue to forget and relearn the lessons of the 1890s. As recent experience with colony collapse disorder has shown us, beekeepers still bear the brunt of losses from widespread insecticide use. And in places where compensation programs exist, the burden of evidence remains daunting. Unlike the 1890s, however, when misconceptions about honeybees led a small subset of vocal orchardists to distinguish their interests from those of neighboring beekeepers, 21st century growers are deeply aware of their reliance upon honeybee pollination. This awareness has reached further into public consciousness than ever before in the context of honeybee losses that were so, pronounced and part of, had received wide media coverage about 10 years ago. And the powerful knowledge dissemination tools of social media. Public concern for pollinators has led to swelling memberships in urban beekeeping associations and rooftop hives at luxury hotels. And this is the Royal York Hotel in Toronto. Combined with a significant economic threat of pollinator decline, it has prompted governments on both sides of the border to implement pollinator protection strategies, however modest. Like their 19th century predecessors, beekeepers and allied scientists have led the way in advocating for these protections. Their efforts to educate broader publics on the value of honeybees and other pollinators to agricultural production has made human reliance on insect pollination and the vulnerability of insect populations one of the most successful ecological education stories of the early 21st century. So while beekeeper numbers and their economic power in the Great Lakes region have declined significantly since the late 19th century, their political fortunes, I would say, have surely risen. And I'll close there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. I was wondering if among the beekeepers, they were working on finding bees that are more resistant to pesticides. In other words, I don't know if you can do selective breeding with bees, but if that works at all.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Certainly there's a whole, some of the leading beekeepers, certainly in Southern Ontario, but also Ohio and Michigan, were experimenting with different strains or races of bees, as they called them at the time, not so much for resistance to insecticides, but for docility and handling and things like that. But we have a beekeeper in the room. I don't know, Anthony, if you've got a response to this question about selective breeding of bees. It's challenging, bees, is it not? Maybe you can come to the mic. I'm totally putting you on the spot.
Yeah, there's a lot of selective breeding for not so much insecticides, but pests like the varroa mites and different. The varroa mites in particular are vectors for all kinds of other diseases. So it's trying to select for different traits that are known as VSH, or Varroa sensitive hygienic, and those are more the issue is trying to breed bees that do resist certain naturally occurring pests, but not so much for synthetic chemicals. And that's the difficult thing, because with I guess I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly, in the time period I'm looking at, there's a town in Ontario called Beaton, which is named for Bee Town. And I'm going to forget the beekeeper's name, but he's sort of legendary for bringing in Italian bees. And then there's an island right off Toronto Island, which they used as a place for breeding queens and propagating this new species new to, at least to Ontario and new to the region, that they'd brought in the 19th century. So Italian bees become very popular, but mostly, I think, for their ease in handling and their production.
Hi, I know nothing about apiculture, except one time I helped somebody do a bee beard. That's about it. I'm wondering about the role of popular culture and what it does with science and chemicals and sprayers and things. And so I was thinking about those movies that I was talking about earlier, where in both, the first two that I watched were about government agents arguing to use sprays for different problems. And the locals were resisting.
Yeah. Sorry, carry on.
Oh, well, and the other was then the whole way advertising starts promoting labor saving through cleaning products and chemicals, and then chemicals are safe. And then as late as the 1970s, when I was a kid, 1969, I think, we ran through clouds of DDT in parks where they'd sprayed for mosquitoes. And it was just the norm that chemicals were safe. So even if, for people who should know better, if those powerful norms, could that be a factor in this cycle?
I think that's thank you for the question, in that, I alluded really briefly to the role of government and university scientists here, but they become very vocal advocates for spraying, to the point that spraying actually gets entered into legislation in some states as mandatory. You are required to spray your crops. It was very difficult to do different. And I think the role of governments in creating a sense of safety with some of these compounds, right? Not only encouraging their use, but convincing not only growers, but also the public of the safety of these compounds. And a good example of that is some of the scare around the fact that they're using copper and lead arsenate. It's actually in the UK that around in the 1890s, because they're importing a lot of American apples. And there's a huge scare that blows up in the newspapers because some of the apples are coming with sort of a white wash on them. And they test them in the UK and find that there is some residue of this sort of arsenic spray that's being used. Not always, but sometimes. And so they embark on, the USDA embarks on a series of studies to try to quantify the toxicity of the arsenic on these apples in response to this terrible press about American apples in the UK and the concerns about the ongoing marketing of these apples. And, even though in the companion medical literature at the time, they're demonstrating that arsenic is one of these toxins that has cumulative impact rather than, acute exposure in small amounts. So even though this was known within the medical community, the USDA comes up with, you'd have to eat 20 bushels of apples to have any effect of the arsenics on you. So really, this is perfectly safe. And that's the response. So they sort of quell public concern about the use of these sprays. And I think in the most part, they probably would have been mostly washed off by spring rains. So probably they weren't terribly wrong. But were they looking at the effects of people who had eaten these apples, decades later? No. So.
Thank you.
Along with the pesticides and whatnot, how much does climate change or natural disasters, compound that problem of population bees?
Well, I'm a historian, so I can just bow out of that question entirely. But in that I'm really looking at the late 19th and early 20th century. But I think certainly, especially with respect to forage and nutrition for honeybees, the fact that forage conditions are changing so much that exceptionally dry conditions one year, exceptionally wet conditions another year, the unpredictability of all of this means that plants aren't producing as much nectar in a dry year, for example. So you've got hungry bees, essentially. And I think this applies. The fact that we keep records for honeybees means we can track these effects, but for native pollinators, I think we can extrapolate from what's happening. That if honeybees are suffering from not enough nectar production, certainly native pollinators are faring very poorly. In that we can't pick up the native pollinators and move them as well as we can honeybees. So I guess that would be my answer to that. Raging wildfires in the Canadian context will, I think, the following year produce a lot of the fireweed and other plants that bees really like, but it'll wipe out sort of forage in that 1 year. But again, I defer to the practitioner in the room, really. Any comment on that? You have to go to the mic.
My name is Anthony Meyer. I'm a prof here at Grand Valley. I teach the honeybees and social impact. I'm just introducing myself because what's happening, the challenges to the honeybee population, first of all, bees can be pretty resilient. But as an example of the climate variability, what happens right now, what happened a couple weeks ago, is we get a lot of the maple trees and a lot of other trees starting to bud and starting to bring out pollen. So the honeybees will go out and collect that pollen, and that's almost like a kickstart for the queen to start laying eggs and start brooding. Once there's a buildup of brood in the hive, the bees won't leave that brood. And if it's really, especially when the temperature drops. So the temperature drops, bees still need to eat, but they will do everything to keep that brood warm. And so these next couple weeks are going to be a pretty big challenge for a lot of our West Michigan bees, because if they have started to kickstart that cycle of brooding up, which means the queen is laying, they all of a sudden have to take care of that brood and keep it warm. You see what I'm saying? So if there was more consistent climate, that would naturally be beneficial for the bees, and they can have a more steady growth rate and all of those things. So essentially, the bees will starve to death if they are committed to staying on that brood and keeping it warm because the temperatures are dropping. That's just one example of the climate variability and the challenges that pose. So.
Thank you so much. All right. So the other questions? Maybe? Yes. Okay.
I have a vague question. I was wondering if you could speak more about sort of transnational or binational ideas of nature that you see circulating amongst beekeepers, if that makes sense. Sort of what, I guess what I'm interested in understanding is over time, how are the beekeepers speaking with one another? And especially sort of, and if there's any conflict with sort of urban environmentalism, especially in the late 60s, 70s. Sorry, it's very vague, but yeah.
Thanks, Ramya. I think this is partly why I was attracted to this group of producers in the first place, is I sort of think about them as probably wrongly, and a historian would never use this word, but I think about them as kind of early environmentalists in the broadest sense of the word, in that they are so attuned to seasonality, to bloom, to weather in any given year. And they wrote it all down. So I have this treasure trove of records. When I'm going through the Beekeeping Association records, they not only list or provide verbatim the speeches of visiting, scientists, but they also have things like the question and answer drawer, where they're sharing knowledge and ideas. They're talking about, I've created an out apiary. I'm starting to move my bees further north in order to capture that moving cycle of bloom as spring moves from the south to the north in a place like, here or anywhere. So their attentiveness and their deep knowledge of local flora, I think, a dairy producer would also have similar kinds of knowledge, maybe not quite as pronounced as a beekeeper, but dairy producers also knew the kinds of things that would, the plants they wanted their cows to avoid that would make the milk taste badly. So it's this sort of terroir, I guess, is the best word for it, in that you're seeing the taste of the landscape moved into a product that honeybees are seeking, that beekeepers are seeking to control. And so there's just fascinating things on the record, and I won't keep you all very long, but a beekeeper really frustrated when a grower in the neighborhood plants buckwheat out of season, for example, because it's going to flavor all his honey in a way he wasn't planning. And so attentiveness to seasonality and bloom, but also the necessity of communication with neighbors is also really fascinating about this group of producers. And a lot of them talk about, we need more growers to be beekeepers so that they understand the threats to our livestock. So there's a lot of campaigning about that, and there's certainly farmers who are keeping a few hives on their farm. I'm sort of rambling a bit here, I'm sorry, but the historical records are full of ecological knowledge, and I think that's one of the things that really attracted me in the first place. Is this is a repository of ecological knowledge that they also haven't been used very much, these records. And I think they could help us, they could be a benchmark in terms of climate change in looking at the kinds of things that were blooming, particularly early beekeepers before, in some cases, they're working with basswood forests. So they're working with native ecosystems and waiting for that bloom, right? And that sort of shifts to just different agricultural plants over time. But we certainly see huge changes in agriculture that mean less reliance on clover, which means it's a whole lot harder to be a beekeeper after the 1930s, when you've got fewer people planting clover, for example. Yeah.
Thank you. Other questions? Comments? I have a question, and maybe it's because I don't know very much about bees and their habits. Do you think that the people who were trying to sort of charge the beekeepers with the trespass of their bees were serious about the idea that the bees could be contained within a property? It seems kind of improbable to me, but I will admit I do not know very much about bees' habits.
I think it's just a money grab.
Strategic.
I think so. I think they're using, and beekeepers are very conscious of positioning their bees as livestock in order to position themselves within dialogue with other farmers, with other agriculturalists. We deserve a place in this landscape too. So beekeepers are talking about honeybee pasture or honeybee forage. They're using that same kind of language. And I think their neighbors understood that if they wanted to pasture their cows on land that wasn't theirs, there would be a fee. So you get these sort of arguments from one class of livestock applied to another without recognizing. So there's a lot of debate about, do beekeepers do bees actually, boost my grain production? And of course, it depends on the plant, if they're pollinated by bees or wind or what. So,
Thanks. Other questions from the audience or commentary, maybe? I do have one additional question then, I think, before we close. And I just, as a historian, I always love to ask people this question. And you've been researching this project for some time. What are some of the sources or documents or evidence that you haven't found yet that you would love to find something about? What's that, that sort of one item that you're just like, I really wish I could find this?
yeah, thank you for the question. Who are the beekeepers? That's my question, in that I have these, I have the records of the executive of these beekeeping associations. It's very difficult to tell how big their operations were. I have the agricultural census records, but it's hard to correlate them with the people in the beekeeping association. So I never know if I'm looking at hobbyists or I'm looking at big commercial operators. And I have to make some assumptions that if you're going to an AGM of the beekeeping association, probably you have, quite a lot of stake in the game and you're a larger operator. But it seems like there's a mix. And so that's one of the big questions. And it's something that historians ask is, who are these people? Are they dabblers or are they... And I think today, people joining beekeeping associations might be more like hobbyists, but I don't think we can, extrapolate back in time. We have to, I'm assuming they're mostly commercial operators, but I wish I had the answer to that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks.
I have just a few more closing remarks. I want to make sure that you know that we do have our Cucci office website if you want to keep track of our ongoings. And we have a sign-in sheet if this is your first time at a Cucci office event and you'd like to know more. We'd love to collect your information. And I also want to give a special thanks to our office coordinator, Mary Williford. And I would like Mary to come up here and receive her gift from me for this year. And this is especially poignant this year because Mary is fortunate and deserving of the promotion that she is receiving within the Brooks College. And so she will be moving on to a new position within the college. So this is her last roundtable as a worker. Maybe she'll join us as a guest sometime in the future. We'll see. But I could not have done it without her. She was here at the office when I joined in 2021, and everything about the Cucci office really has depended on her work and her expertise in the field of public history. So I just want to give a thanks and a gift. Thank you so much for that. We look forward to working with you all in the coming year, maybe seeing you at our next roundtable next March. And please feel free to connect with me any way you want about for future collaborations so we can work on promoting our West Michigan history. Thanks.